All right, welcome everyone to another Salty Dog webinar. I'm Alex Helfand, Education Coordinator. Many of you already know me from the past, and I'll make a little more of an introduction in a moment. So, as an introduction, I want to talk a little bit about why the three of us are here today. So, with us is Tim Metcalf and George Day, both of whom are muted at the moment. Guys, don't forget to unmute yourself. Collectively, we have about 165 years of experience on the water and 162,000 nautical miles. A lot of that we have to attribute to George. And this includes 1.5 circumnavigations, 5 transatlantic, North Atlantic crossings, 1 South Atlantic crossing, and between the three of us, we have 16 East Coast to Caribbean passages one way or the other. We all have a passion for sailing and passage making, and we all, I think this runs pretty deep in our belief that it can and should be done safely. So with that, as I said, you know who I am. I've done 1 Atlantic crossing, 3 East Coast Caribbean passages, and several passages to Maine. And this year we went to Nova Scotia. So I consider myself the piker among the three of us. But the more important thing is, from my perspective, the discussion we're going to have today about equipment and the topics related to it, and safety and the topics related to it, are really essential to safe passage making. I think you, as the captain or the owner of your vessel, you've got to, I hope you realize, I'm sure you realize, you have a responsibility to your vessel, yourself, your crew, and to the other vessels around you to make sure you've properly prepared your boat and the crew. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm really happy that we've got on the panel Tim Metcalf, who's the manager of safety communications, tracking, and emergency response for the Salty Dogs, and George Day, who's vice president of the SDSA and the publisher of Blue Water Sailing, Multi-Hulls Today, Cruising Compass, and Cruising Odyssey. So I'm going to ask Tim to make a little bit more of an introduction for himself, and then George will speak a moment after that, and then I will make 1 or 2 other reminders before we move on. Tim?
Thanks, Alex. So I'm Tim Metcalf. I am the manager of safety communications, shoreside communications, tracking, and emergency response, to which you might say, what else is there? But I've been associated with Salty Dogs, the Salty Dog Sailing Association, since the day they were founded. And my responsibility includes making sure that you all have the ability to communicate with our shoreside coordinators, that we can track you every inch of the way from the time you leave the shore until you get to your destination. And that should you run into an emergency situation, we have a team of people that can help respond to that emergency and vector assets to your location along with the Coast Guard if necessary. So that's my interest in the whole thing. I come to this from a marine electronics background and a software background. I worked for a little software company in upstate New York for 30 years that you may have heard of. It was named IBM. And I'm an authorized garment installing marine electronics dealer. So I have a passion for electronics, and I have a passion for safety. Alex? Alex, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So, George, you want to say a little bit more about yourself, and maybe a bit about why we're talking today?
Sure. It's my pleasure. George Day, I'm the publisher and editor of the magazines that Alex mentioned: Blue Water Sailing, Multi-Hulls Today, Cruising Compass, and Cruising Odyssey. I actually was one of the founding editors of Cruising World back in the 70s, and my experience is pretty extensive. Probably 125,000 miles offshore, including a 5-year circumnavigation with my family. And earlier in my career, a year spent vagabonding around the South Pacific with a friend of mine we actually sailed from Portugal to New Zealand. So we put a few miles in. The reason why I'm so interested in this topic and here today is because so much of our safety at sea depends on the preparation we do and the knowledge that gets passed down from mentors and from people like Alex and Tim and myself who have been out there and done it and can share our experiences. And so preparation, practice, and preparation, practice are so important. So that's why we're here. Alex?
All right, thanks. So before we get into the details of today's talk, I just want to let everyone know that there is a tremendous amount of material that we could not cover today. So we have another webinar on passage making scheduled for August 31st, at which time we're going to talk about what we refer to as the quality of life aboard considerations. And this is going to include things like water makers, passerelles, that's the extension that you put off the back of your boat when you're med-mooring and trying to get onto the dock. What kind of dinghy and outboard you probably should have if you're going to be planning on going to Caribbean. And some of us can speak from experience about what worked and what didn't work, or what works now. Getting on and off the boat, enclosures, solar and wind. We'll talk a little bit about Starlink and essentially a lot of other onboard considerations that can make life aboard a lot happier for everybody. So tune into that one. There'll be another announcement. So we divided today's talk into 3 sections. Tim is going to talk about comms and electronics, as you probably suspected. George is going to talk about safety equipment, and I'll talk about preparation. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Tim.
Terrific. I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides to show. Where the heck is it? There it is. And we will go from there. There we go. So let me just say something to begin with. One of the things George said triggered this. My first 2 offshore trips were the 1989 and 1991 Marion Bermuda race, which is 650 miles from basically Boston to Bermuda. And at the time, the Marion Bermuda was what was called a fair means navigation race, which meant you weren't allowed to use sat-nav, which was in its infancy. From the time you passed the 100 fathom curve leaving the US until your navigator said that you had were 40 miles from the 100 fathom curve going into Bermuda, which is basically 40 miles from Bermuda. So we use celestial nav all the way. And I would call my wife from a payphone before we left and say, honey, we're going to be leaving in a couple of hours, and I'll call you when we get to Bermuda. And 4.5 days later, I would call her from a payphone in Bermuda. And the advances in that time are just incredible. So that being said, I'm not going to read every word on these slides to you, but these are important. And if you go back and look at the recording, or I'll make these slides available if you want them to, our underlying principle has always been education before requirements. So we don't want to put a lot of requirements on people. We don't inspect boats. We just want to have a bare minimum of absolute requirements that we need in order to be able, from my point of view, to be able to communicate with and track the boats when they're offshore. One of my teams is the shoreside coordination team, and their responsibility is to work with the boats once they leave the shore and until they reach their destination. If they have any issues, talk to them, know where they are. If they stop tracking, tell them you've stopped tracking. We work to get you back tracking again. If there's an emergency, one of my other teams is the emergency response team, and we're blessed to have a team of just very experienced people, some of them Coast Guard retirees who got a great deal of experience, and they've done a marvelous job with the relatively small number of emergencies that we've had in past rallies. So what do we absolutely require? The absolute requirement for every rally, we want you to have a permanently mounted VHF, 25-watt VHF, proper antenna, with your location and MMSI properly available to the radio. And it's important that you have that MMSI. I am an absolute hawk on this. A few years ago, I did a seminar for the local, I'm in the Great Lakes area, in the Detroit area, for the Detroit Regional Yacht Racing Association, called How Your VHF Radio Can Save Your Life or Not. And I recounted a couple of personal experiences that I listened to, where people either properly had their radios set up or they didn't. And a handheld VHF. If you go offshore, we need two devices, one of which must be capable of sending your position 4 times a day. One of them needs to have long form email. That's a new requirement as of this fall's rally. The second can use short form emails or texts, such as an inReach. We'll talk about that in a second. One device must be capable of sending that position 4 times a day, at least 4 times a day, to our tracking partner, PredictWind, so that you will show up on the fleet tracking map. So what are our currently supported devices? The Iridium Go family, either the Iridium Go or the Iridium Go Exec. The Iridium Go Exec is a newer device, offers higher bandwidth, gives you some internet connectivity. The Garmin inReach family, the inReach Mini 2. My favorite offering there is the inReach Mini 2 Marine Bundle. The GPS Map 86i or 86SCI offers some charting. Brand new for this fall is Zoleo. PredictWind now supports Zoleo. You'll find instructions on that in the Offshore Rally Passage Handbook. We are, for the first time this fall, conditionally approving Starlink. We recommend strongly that, we don't recommend, you need to opt into mobile priority if you're going to be offshore. And if you want to report your position using your Starlink, the PredictWind Data Hub hooks right into your connection, and it reports all that position to PredictWind and a bunch of other data, so that you show up on the fleet tracking map. SpotX is an option. It is, quite honestly, it's not my favorite option. I've been on boats with Globalstar coverage. Globalstar, I could spend a lot more time telling you why, but there's soft spots south and east of Bermuda where you have a hard time getting your messages to shore. SpotX also has a 120 character limit as opposed to 160 character for SpotX or for inReach, and much longer for the Zoleo. So what do we strongly, so that's required. Those are our only requirements. And I don't think, quite frankly, that that's too much to ask. What do we strongly recommend? And strongly recommend doesn't mean we don't think it's important, but it means we're not going to tell you what to do, and it's your gun and your foot. So for all rallies, we certainly recommend an emergency VHF antenna. If your rig comes down and you need to use your VHF antenna, or you use your VHF, having an emergency VHF antenna would be extremely beneficial. A handheld VHF, most of you will have a chart plotter. And if something happens to that chart plotter, this would be a backup and help you understand where you are at least. Radar is a great option. Radar helps you identify who's around you. And an AIS transponder. I mean, AIS the transponders have become much more affordable. My experience with AIS transponders is if I'm in a crossing situation with a freighter or a tug with a tow, that boat is much more likely to respond to my call to negotiate what do I want, what do they want me to do, if they can see me on their screen. So I think AIS is just a really good thing to have, and it's well worth the expense. In addition, if you have an AIS transponder, if it's a newer one, the newer Raymarine or the Garmin AIS 800 that are satellite capable, you'll be visible on marine traffic even while you're offshore, which gives more flexibility, and your friends and family will be able to see on marine traffic or on our AIS tracking map. For offshore rallies, strongly recommend an EPIRB. I mean, you have to have an EPIRB is a device of last resort. You find yourself in an emergency situation, you trigger the EPIRB in 90 seconds. that signal goes up to a search and rescue satellite. The signal goes down to the closest emergency response center, gets vectored to the owning country, and they figure out how to vector assets to your location. If you have an EPIRB, though, it is absolutely essential that it's properly registered. You have a current registration, and you want to make sure your battery is currently in date as of the arrival at your destination. So even though those batteries will probably last 10 years beyond when you arrive at the destination, I really recommend look at the expiration date on the battery and make sure it's current. And just as an aside, I will also tell you, if you have an EPIRB and you decide to buy a new one and get rid of the old one, make sure you unregister the EPIRB that you currently have. I talked to some Coast Guard guys that they've told me they have to investigate every EPIRB set off that they receive, and the number of responses that they've made to garbage dumps because somebody threw away their EPIRB and it accidentally got activated. So make sure if you get rid of your EPIRB that you unregister it so that they're not going to come and track you down. Recommended equipment for every rally. Consider personal locator beacon or an AIS or digital selective calling MOB device. So personal locator beacon is a personal EPIRB. The difference between an EPIRB and a PLB is that on an EPIRB, the battery has to last for 48 hours. On a PLB, it only has to last for 24 hours. AIS beacons, on the other hand, work as it says using AIS. So if you have an AIS, if someone has an AIS receiver, they will get you as a target if you're in the water. DSC, same thing. That's a digital selective calling. That's a VHF. So that's on VHF channel 70. And so again, for PLBs, properly registered, make sure your battery's in date, make sure everything else is in date as of your date of arrival. What do I think you need to do to prepare? Number one, read the passage handbook. There's not just because I wrote it, and I did write it, but there's a lot of valuable information in there. It explains to you how to set up tracking. It explains to you how to get weather. It explains when the weather broadcasts are going to be. It explains what your emergency phone numbers and frequencies are. Test your VHF. Increasingly, we're trying to test your offshore email. You can't believe the number of times that we've had people go offshore and then email us saying, oops, I gave you the wrong offshore email address. It's very important that you validate your offshore email address, your satellite phone number, to know that they're both accurate. We promise not to bother you, but if we need to know that that information is correct. Initiate and confirm position reporting. So before you leave, set up, if you're using your Iridium Go to do tracking, make sure it's active. If you're using your InReach to do tracking, make sure it's active. And we will be checking to make sure that every boat in the rally is on the tracking map before departure date. And we pride ourselves on having everybody there. Chris Parker is going to send you an email a week or so before departure with an account that he's created for you for weather. You need to log into that account and you need to set up to 5 email addresses where you're going to receive weather email while you're offshore. And it can be you on the boat, and it could be your brother-in-law who also fancies himself to be a weatherman, who's going to read that and interpret Chris's report and then send you his opinion. Confirm that you're getting Chris's weather emails. The biggest message we get in the first 3 days after the fleet leaves the shore is, how come I'm not getting weather from Chris Parker? So please make sure that that's true. I can't stress enough that it's important to get started on the communication stuff early. It tends to be the thing that people leave to the end. And it's important to do that as early as you can. And finally, if you have an SSB, test your SSB. We don't offer, we do have some SSB consultation. We will set up the SSB nets, but try the SSB out, make sure it works, make sure you know how to use it, read the books. If you really need some tutorials, get a hold of me. We'll see if we can set you up with stuff. Strongly recommended. Strong. And if you have navigation electronics, say Garmin or Raymarine or B&G or Lowrance, update the software. If you don't know how to update the software, get a hold of somebody who can update the software for you. You will find that new features have been introduced, that bugs have been corrected. Make sure that your electronic charts, and if you haven't, and I hope you do, paper charts are current. And finally, not many people think of this. Deviate your compass. Take your electronic compass out and calibrate it. The manufacturers call it calibration. What it's actually doing is deviating the compass. But for a lot of the heading sensors, if you move your boat 200 nautical miles, you ought to recalibrate the compass. So that is what I wanted to say. Now I'll open the floor for questions. I've probably spoken about 180 words a minute, and hopefully you kept up.
Right.
Questions?
So if you have any questions specific to what Tim just talked about, please put them into the chat now, and we'll try to answer those. If your questions come later, that's okay. Or come to you later, put them in then, and we'll get back to them. So
there was a question: will it cover PLBs and such? And George commented on this when we were having our pre-meeting. ACR recently introduced a device that is for the first time incorporates a PLB, an AIS MOB device, and a DSC MOB device all in one unit, which I'm a Great Lakes sailor, and on the Great Lakes, an AIS or a DSC device makes a lot more sense than a PLB, because you don't need that signal to be sent up to the SARSAT satellite and then back down to shore. I would much rather that a boat that's 2 miles away gets my signal. How to recalibrate an electronic compass. You need to look at your individual autopilot, because that's where the calibration is going to take place. I know how to do it on a Garmin autopilot. I could probably figure out how to do it on a Raymarine pilot, but it will be in the autopilot setup section.
Okay, any other questions at this point? If not, we're gonna hand the floor over to George.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Tim. That was really good. Can everyone hear me all right? Alex, can you hear me all right? Good. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be part of this. I forgot to mention when I was doing my intro that I actually have been involved with the Salty Dogs since day one. Phil and Linda Knowles, who started the Salty Dog Rally, and I got together for lunch one day long ago, and so the three of us actually were the sort of the first working team. I was the first member of the board, and was the treasurer and secretary for a number of years, and so this has been the Salty Dogs has been kind of a passion and a recreation of mine for the last 12 years, and so I'm really happy to be part of this team, and really admire what Alex and Tim have put together in terms of Tim's communications and shoreside support, and Alex's education program. Both are wonderful contributions to the Salty Dog experience and membership. One thing I should just mention right at the start, that education is what we're all about, but there's a lot of education out there, and so if you're a member of the Salty Dog sailing, Salty Dogs, you have access to a wealth of information on the website. where you can go back and review these webinars and go back and answer questions that you might have, or have your crew, more importantly, probably have your crew get themselves up to speed. And also this U.S. sailing, in another hat that I've been the chairman of the cruising committee for U.S. sailing for several years, and U.S. sailing runs the safety at sea seminars around North America, mostly in the winter and spring, but some in the fall as well. And safety at sea seminars run by U.S. sailing are one wonderful way to get your self up to speed in terms of what are the standard practices used by major offshore regattas for safety, and how do you integrate the skills and the knowledge and the practices that you need to be safe at sea. So those are, I think, the very compatible resources for those who are trying to get more education, trying to learn more about safety at sea. I just want to start with a little anecdote, because the amount of sailing I've done, I've run into a lot of people, and I've been through a lot of incidences, and one has always stuck in my mind. And it was a friend of mine, Jim and Betsy, were sailing their Atkin Ingrid catch around the world, and they had left the East Coast and sailed to Panama. From Panama went to the Galapagos, and they were heading then west 3,000 miles across the South Pacific to French Polynesia, the Marquesas. And one afternoon, when they were about a week out, Jim wanted to adjust the leech line on the mainsail, and they were sailing wing and wing with a pole on the Genoa and the main strapped out. And he went out to adjust the leech line, and as he was reaching out to the boom, the boat lurched and he went over the side. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He was not wearing a harness. He was not wearing a PFD, as was the norm back in those days. And the boat was sailing at 6.5 knots, dead downwind. So Betsy was in the cockpit, luckily, and she was able to. She tried to throw the man overboard pole and flotation, the ring, back to so she could place a marker for Jim and for her, but it got caught in the wind vane steering device, and she ended up dragging it behind the boat. So that didn't work. So she immediately threw the boat into a jibe, and put the boat on a beam reach, and started counting. And this is something we did in the old days, and she counted until she could get the jib down, get the pole down, get the main tamed, and and get the engine on, and then she turned around and went on a reciprocal course, the same number of counting seconds that she'd counted, which is about 130 seconds, 140 seconds. It was 3 minutes, 180 seconds. So she went back 3 minutes and at the same speed, and then turned on the reciprocal course they've been sailing on, and went to where she thought he probably went overboard. And she went there and a little farther because of the current, and then she stopped and started signaling, and no sign of him, no sign of Jim. Sun was going down, it's getting darker, and she wasn't quite sure what to do, so she just continued to motor on a little bit further on. She just wasn't going to give up. She circled a few times, didn't see him, went further on, circled a few times, and then she was kind of resigning herself that it was going to get dark and it's going to be impossible to find him. When she plowed into a large trade wind swell, and the bowsprit of her Ingrid 38 came up through the wave, and on the bowsprit was her husband Jim, and she'd run right over him, and in this miraculous rescue in the middle of the South Pacific. So just as an anecdote to put in the back of your mind, you don't want to fall overboard, but if someone falls overboard on your boat, you need to have a plan. And Betsy had this plan in her mind. They'd practiced it before and they had worked it through. And these days, if someone goes overboard, you hit the red man overboard button on the GPS or on the MFD, and that should do the job for you. But still, you have to think about what you are going to do if someone goes overboard, because a man overboard for a passage maker at sea is the biggest, is honestly, other than being run down by a ship, is the greatest risk and the greatest danger. So we'll start with just thinking about what gear you need to have. Everyone on board should have an inflatable personal flotation device with a harness, and the harness should have clips on it that are like the Wishard harnesses that are two action clips. Carabiners don't work. Carabiners are bad. You put a carabiner on a pad eye on deck and pull it sideways, and it will open itself. So you need to have a 2-action clip, and the Wishard is the one I prefer. Harnesses, there are a number of ways of thinking about harnesses, but you want to be able to clip in short and clip in long. So many harnesses you can find on the market will have an intermediary clip, so you can clip in short. One of the reasons you want to clip in short is because if you do get knocked over, or if you do fall and you go over the side, if you're on the long link, you'll find yourself down in the water being dragged by the side of the boat. That's not a good situation, particularly if you're on watch alone at night. So you really want to clip in short, and that's that's a good option. And again, Wishard makes a very good. I hate to plug products. I know Tim would not want me to do this, but this is in my experience. So with the safety harness, the PLB, you can put. I mean, with the personal flotation device, you can put the PLB that you're carrying, and I recommend everyone have their own personal flotation device, personal locator beacon, and you put that in your life jacket, so that if you go in the water, it'll automatically initiate a signal, and that's a sort of an essential, to my mind, an essential piece of safety equipment. But one of the things you want to think about when you're clipping on, you have your harness, you have your personal flotation device. If you're going on deck, if you're going forward, you'll need to have jack lines running up and down the side of the boat, and also you need to have hard clipping points in the cockpit. One of the things that most of us like to do is to put a hard pad eye right near the companionway, so that if you're making the transition from down below to the cockpit in bad weather, you want to be able to clip in right away before you come out through the companionway, and then you'll be secure. Even if a boarding wave comes into the cockpit and knocks you over sideways, you'll still be clipped on. So that's a little extra thing to think about. And then in the cockpit, you can either rig, in big cockpits like on the more modern boats, you can rig jack lines, or you can just rig hard pad eyes that you move from back and forth.
George?
Yeah.
Just one comment. You talked about the double tether.
Yeah.
Be very careful not to clip the inactive tether to the ring on your harness.
Exactly.
Because you want to have a snap shackle attached to the harness, so that if you're dragged in the water upside down and you decide you're going to trip the snap shackle, that second tether doesn't then engage the harness, which means you'll never get it off.
So look at what Alex is holding up. So that's the release from your harness. But if the intermediary shackle on the tether is clipped to the ring, then you're still attached to the boat. So
and you cannot get that Wishard hook off, because it's under tension and you'll never get it off.
Right. So that's good point, guys. Thank you very much. Every boat should have some sort of way of getting a person in the water back onto the boat. And I've done a number of tests with U.S. Sailing and with other groups about what are the best ways of getting a person in the water back in the boat. And there have been some fairly interesting devices developed, but basically the tests that were done by the Seattle Sailing Foundation back in about 25 years ago came up with the life sling, and the life sling and an attendant shackle and tackle is certainly the best way to get a person back out of the water, and every boat should have a life sling right there in the cockpit ready to throw overboard. And again, you also should have some sort of a throwable device a quoit or something that you can throw to a person in the water so they can become attached to the boat, because once you get the person attached to the boat, the chances of them being rescued go up measurably, go up, really a lot. So, yeah, so you need to have personal flotation device, a PLB, a really good harness, and then the boat has to be equipped with jack lines and with hard point connections. And then you need to have a throwable device in the cockpit so you can get someone back next to the boat. And then you have a life sling to get them back out of the water. So that's sort of the man overboard scenario. Obviously, one hand for the ship, one hand for yourself. Falling off a boat is not a good idea, but it does happen, as my story of Jim and Betsy does illustrated. So moving on from the man overboard situation, just basic gear that I think every boat should have on board. Obviously, you need to have all of the required safety gear, Coast Guard required safety gear, and the safety gear for the countries you're visiting. So most countries in the Caribbean, where the Salty Dogs sail, are members of the IMO, the International Maritime Organization. The IMO has a standard of safety called the SOLAS, requirements, and SOLAS is safety of life at sea, and so that lists a whole series of recommended or required for commercial vessels gear, equipment, and procedures. And so look up SOLAS preparations. And so if you're going off to buy flares, buy SOLAS flares. They're the best. They're the ones that'll last you the longest. And if you do already have some flares that are coming up on expiry dates, they actually will last a year or two or three longer. So don't throw them out. Buy the new ones that are current. But it's important, even in the age of electronics, for the Coast Guard or for ships that are trying to rescue people off their boats to have hard visuals to look at. And flares are certainly something that's very important. As I think, as Tim was mentioning, every boat heading offshore should have a life raft. It's just silly not to. The reason for that is that there are several things can go wrong, but containers fall off ships regularly. The insurance companies, Lloyd's and others that insure container ships, are very stingy about giving off the numbers of how many containers are actually lost every year at sea, but there are hundreds and hundreds of them lost at sea in storms, particularly in the winter. And these containers tend to circle around the center of the oceans, around the Bermuda High in the Atlantic and the North Pacific High in the Pacific. And if you bang into a half submerged container at 2 a.m, when you're roaring along at 7-8 knots downwind, you can poke a pretty big hole in your boat. And so you need to have a life raft. Catamaran sailors, it's debatable, but I still think, Alex, don't you think catamaran sailors should have life rafts?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I wouldn't go offshore without it. And we
Right.
we have one.
So have a life raft of a size that's going to be big enough for your largest potential cruise. So if you normally sail as a couple, but you take 2 other people offshore with you to make a passage, or 3, a 4-man life raft would be the minimum. If you've ever actually sat in a 4-man life raft and think about having to spend time with your buddies in one, a 6-man life raft looks a lot more attractive, I promise you. They're more expensive, but they're actually safer. And look for a life raft that has ballast buoys on the bottom of it. Most of the best models do, Avon particularly, or a Givens life raft, or Revere. The ultralights for airplanes, the Winslow, for example, they have advantages and disadvantages. They're light, and so they can be blown over more easily in gusty winds and high seas, but they're also small enough so the smallest person on the boat can lift it and deploy it. And that's important. You have to think, who's the smallest person on the boat, and can this person actually launch the life raft? So that gives Winslow a kind of an edge on that aspect.
George?
Yeah.
I sail and race. I don't race anymore, but I have raced on the Great Lakes, and I've never been on a distance race on the Great Lakes without a raft.
Sure, absolutely. You would have to be insensible to do so.
Albeit on the Great Lakes without a canopy.
Yeah, yeah, but sure, a platform where you can be found and rescued.
Absolutely.
steering is an interesting thing. The most vulnerable thing on most of our boats these days are the rudders. Most of us have boats that have either spade rudders or there's skeg hung spade rudders. And with the orcas eating rudders off the coast of Spain, or flotsam and jetsam banging rudders anywhere we go, rudders are the most vulnerable system on the boat, and the steering cables and the system that runs from the wheel autopilot rudder is the thing that's most likely to cause serious gear failure. And so having a way to steer the boat with broken cables, let's say you have the rudders intact, but you have broken cables, you need to be able to use the emergency tiller. And almost all boats have emergency tillers. If they don't, you should have one made for your boat. I've used them. We lost on a race from Miami to Montego Bay. We lost steering going through the Bahamas. We were inside Cat Island, 2 in the morning, when it always happens, and we lost steering, and we had to get the emergency tiller out. And none of us had used it on this race boat, so we put it in, and it turned out that you had to use your full power of your legs to steer the boat. That you could not steer the boat by hand. It was just way too much trouble, and it took us a couple of hours to fix the steering system. And so we were there, man on man, steering the boat with our quads, trying to just keep the thing on track. So it's important to know how your emergency tiller works, and how and the kind of pressure that it's going to require, and to be able to steer the boat if the steering system fails. But beyond that, losing your rudder altogether, and this happens every year, and I know that there was one Caribbean 1500 race a few years ago where 2 or 3 boats lost their rudders, and two of the boats were abandoned. One boat sailed in because the boat had figured out its backup steering system. And boats can be steered without a rudder. There's no question about it. But it's not easy. And modern boats with fin keels are much harder to steer than full keel boats with attached that might have had an attached rudder. So you think about, what is your plan B for steering? I don't think calling the Coast Guard is the first. That shouldn't be plan B. That should be plan C or D. I mean, you should be self-sufficient enough in some way to be able to steer your boat with reduced sail, so that the steering system, so the boat can be steered. And there is a way of using a drogue, and the preferred drogue is the gale rider. And if you rig a drogue from amidships cleats on a harness, and then the sheets running back to the cockpit, you can in fact steer a sailboat with reduced sail perfectly fine. And the boat, if you settle the boat down, you can use the gale rider to steer the boat. I mean, obviously the gale rider is also used for running before a gale, and will slow your boat down and help you maintain control of the boat. But if your steering is lost, a gale rider and a harness rigged to amidships cleats is the way to go. And if you go into YouTube and look for a video on steering your boat with a gale rider, there's a really good video that shows you how to do that. So other gear that's just important to have on board, obviously a high-powered spotlight, so you can, for signaling or for looking for buoys. You need to have fire extinguishers. That's part of your normal thing. High-capacity bilge pumps. I put a 3,000 gallon an hour bilge pump on the boat I sailed around the world, and I was very glad I had it. I never had to use it, but I knew that I could stem pretty much any leak that I would have long enough for me to find the leak, and then use the wooden plugs. And this is something that also you should have, is wooden plugs that are shaped the diameter of the hoses that go through your seacock, so you can shut off a seacock with a mechanical plug if the seacock itself is seized, or if the seacock broke itself. So mechanical plugs I keep on my boats. I keep them right next to the seacock, so they're right there on a lanyard, and then they're there when you need them. For other safety things, first aid kit. When we sailed around the world, we went to our family doctor, and he sat us down for an hour very nicely, and he gave us a file card file card or files on how to deal with a whole range of common ailments, and then the medicines that you needed to deal with that. And so we call it medical school in a box. It was a really great way. We had children with us, and we needed to be able to be self-sufficient that way to a certain extent. But there are lots of good books, and there are lots of commercial outfits that sell kits. In my experience, the commercial outfits kits are really great, but once you open them, it's almost impossible to get everything back in the container because they've been contained so tightly. So, but a good medical kit, and then the knowledge that goes with it is important. So moving on to my last category is really should be for any sailor should, I think, be the first category, and that is, how do you set your boat up for safe sailing? What is it you're doing with your sails, your rig, and the way you've run your rig to make yourself safe and your crew safe while you're sailing offshore? And often you're thinking about one person on watch, standing a 3 or 4 hour watch, and how is that person going to manage the boat, and what can they do to reef, to douse sails, to look after the boat if you're hit by a squall or whatever. I think it's important for all of us to think about what is our plan when we have sustained winds of 40 knots for 10 to 12 hours or more. What is our plan? So the thing is on most of our modern sloops, and most of us are sailing modern sloops, have either slab reefing or in-mast roller reefing, and a few have in-boom roller reefing. But the in-mast and in-boom roller reefing have infinite reefing ability, but you have to know how to reef these configurations in rising winds and be able to reef sailing downwind without having to round up into the wind every time you try to reef. So it takes practice. You have to get out there and really practice how you handle the big sail, the mainsail, in rising winds. And then for slab reef sails, again, if we have slightly older boats or more conventional rigs, a third reef is an important step to take. You may want to try to rig a storm trysail on the main, or you may think that you're going to do that, but in fact, what you're really going to do in 99% of the instances running in high winds offshore is you're going to just put a third reef in, and that means reefing all the reefing lines before you head offshore, and having the third reef there to put in. And you'll find that I know that when I was sailing with Bob Osborne, who's the president of the SDSA, last fall, we sailed his 47-footer to the Caribbean in the fall rally, and we've had the third reef in probably 15% of the time, particularly when we get down into the trade winds. But also when we left the North America, we had some fairly brisk breezes, and we threw the third reef in, and the boat was still sailing along at 8.5, 9 knots, and the boat was sailing flat, and we were unstressed, and the boat was unstressed. And it is a very good investment, I think. A storm trysail is, to me, a less good investment because, in fact, it's less a good sail. It will perform worse than a third reef in a mainsail, and so. But it's an option. It's an old-fashioned option, but I wouldn't go that direction myself. And then, what are we doing about headsails? In order for a boat to be happy in bad weather, it needs to be balanced, and the helm has to be balanced, and the crew has to feel balanced, and that means some sort of a storm headsail. Most of us have Genoas that are just on roller furling gear, and you can roll those up to about a half or maybe 2/3 of the size of the sail without developing a bag so big in the middle of the sail that it becomes an untenable sailing device. You can move the sheet cars forward. You can do all kinds of things to try to make it a better sail, or you can douse it altogether, depending on how your rig goes. But a good option is to have, especially on roller furling rigs that have Genoas, is to look at some sort of a storm sail of some sort. And if you don't have a staysail stay, you don't really have an option for flying a staysail. So one way to go is to use a device called a gale sail, which is a sail built by ATN in Florida, and it's bright orange, and it slips right over the rolled up roller furling Genoa and gives you a much reduced sail area very easily and quickly. And so it's a good option, and it's one that I've always carried one on my boats and on my sloops, not on my catch, and so thinking about what you're going to do in 40 knots is an important part of your safety planning. And so I suppose the last part of that is learning how to make your boat heave to, and heaving to is a perfectly honorable tradition. There are many times when you want to just stop, because either you're coming to the Gulf Stream in a gale, or you're looking at a rising gale ahead of you. I know the boat's coming back from the Caribbean in the homeward bound rally this year. They all slowed way down to let a system go past them to the north, and that you could have hove to or just jogged along. And it's good to know how to do that. And so every boat has his own way of doing it, but oftentimes on a modern sloop, you have to take a sheet and run it inside the outboard stays. Otherwise, the sheets will be chafing on the stays as you're trying to heave to the boat. And so, as well as practicing that, seeing how you're going to heave to, and what you're going to do when you need to. I mean, if someone gets injured or you need to make repairs, there are times when you have to just stop the boat. So, and with that, I'll hand it back to Alex, and thank you very much.
George, okay, just one comment about medications that you referenced. If you're the skipper, you should require your crew to be honest with you about their medical conditions, and ask them. I suggest you ask them to bring 3 times the amount of medication, any prescription medications that they take on the trip. One third for what they think they will need on the trip, 1/3 as a spare, and 1/3 to go in the ditch bag.
Good idea.
Yeah,
I can tell you where that came from, but it takes
And Tim, I believe there was an incident some years back where somebody's meds ended up in the head,
in the toilet.
literally
Yes,
down the toilet.
we won't literally down the toilet, and we won't have that discussion now.
Right. But what Tim is basically saying is, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Separate them. And with respect to the gale sail that George mentioned, which I don't have yet, but I'm very tempted to get one, because we have a cat where we can roll our jib up, but the sail shape is horrible. And I also think it puts some very strange stresses on the rig when you do that. You do need an extra halyard. So either you need a second Genoa halyard or jib halyard, or I think you can use your spinnaker halyard depending
Spinnaker
upon
halyard works, yeah.
right where it exits. So as long as you have that as an option, it's it's a pretty simple rig to put together. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about, oh, by the way, are there any other questions on what George has just mentioned? I did hold up before my favorite harness, not harness, my tether, which is 2, 1 long, 1 short, and it's got the quick release. We have another type as well on board, which works okay, but I think this is probably the best one that we've got. And I'll mention later, but just since it's on the tip of my tongue, you need to have your crew practice how to move about the boat with using a long and a short, and always knowing how to switch from one tether to the other. But you don't ever disconnect both when you're moving about. You're always attached with one of them, and they do have to practice. And there is a video, a webinar that we have that does show even how one can walk about the boat with it and be effective and kind of keeping yourself on. So if there are any other questions, I do see a note that there was a question, let's see, about the gale sail. There's also the question about the drogues and catamarans. There is a debate whether you really need to slow, do you need a drogue on a cat? You need a way to slow your boat down. And I think one of the other things that George was kind of talking about when he mentioned that on Bob Osborne's boat, they went to a third reef and the boat was still flying along, but it was a lot more comfortable. Slowing the boat down definitely reduces the stress on everyone, and you still get there probably as quickly as if you, kept more sail up and put a lot more stress in the boat. So look for ways to do that. And I'll reiterate what George mentioned about using the gale rider as a means of steering the boat. Because when you put that behind the boat, you kind of center it, and then with those two lines going to either side of the boat, you pull it to one side or the other, and it basically acts like a rudder, and you can steer, and it would work really well on a catamaran. So that was one of the
The
questions.
key to that, Alex, is to run the lines through snatch blocks on the
Right.
midship's cleats. They have to be over the center of gravity. It doesn't work well if you run them from the quarters, from the transoms. You really have to run them from the middle of the boat. That way the
Right.
boat will pivot around the center of gravity.
Yeah, I think for sure that's what you have to do on a monohull. Somebody asked about it with respect to a cat, and since I think with the cat we can probably get away with it on the corner at the stern, but you do have to run the lines to a winch. You can't just do it by hand.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And
On a cat, of course, you have a spare rudder. So
yeah, I don't. Somebody else is on the call who might be able to talk about how effective one rudder works, because I think it can be a little bit challenging. But there's one last question here about we have a cat with 2 reefs. Should we get a third? And the answer is yes. I don't know enough about. I would say absolutely. Unless it turns out that your first reef is really deep and your second reef is even deeper, but chances are it's not the case. So that third reef is very deep and it acts just like a storm sail. All right. So I'm going to talk about preparation, and I'm going to talk about preparation. Sorry. I'm just going to put one thing in right now into the chat. I did this before, but I'm doing it again. The entire discussion that we have today, that Tim had put together a really great document. The link to that on the website is now in the chat. And then there's a comprehensive checklist that's also in there. So you don't have to take a lot of notes. Now, everything that we're talking about is pretty much in that document. So just as a note. So I'm going to talk about preparation. First note is fuel. At a minimum, you need to be able to motor for about 25% of the distance of the passage. So going down to Antigua, we're talking could be 1,500 miles plus or minus. So you need to have sufficient fuel for at least 25% of that distance. I personally carry a lot more. There's sometimes the trades really cooperate and you'll be sailing most of the time. Other times, one direction or the other, you're going to be doing a lot of motoring, and you want to know that you have the fuel to do that.
And Alex, I will note that we look at what you put into your profile on how much motoring range do you have, and if it's less than 25%, we'll probably contact you and ask you, don't you want to have some more?
Great. Next is drinking water. At a minimum, you need about a half a gallon of water per person per day. In a hot environment, or if somebody's ill, they're going to use more. So the recommendation is you really probably should have more like a gallon of water per day per person for at a minimum, so let's say 20 days. And I point out that this water needs to be separate from the water in your water tanks and from any water you think you're going to make with your water maker, because water makers break and water tanks get leaks or end up with salt intrusion. So make sure you've got sufficient spare water on board. And then with all of your containers, whether it's fuel, water, if they're on deck, you need to seriously look at how you've come up with the way to lash them down, and that those containers close properly and stay closed. As to food on board, we suggest you have about 1.5 times the food for all the crew that you got, for 1.5 times the length of the passage. That should probably get you there in pretty good shape, and we'll talk more about food in some other webinars coming up. Then we come to spare parts, and obviously there's some very obvious things such as belts, water pump impellers. My suggestion is use the ones the manufacturers represent. Don't buy the third-party ones, particularly when it comes to impellers. Sometimes they'll cause more trouble than not. If you've got motors with replaceable brushes, you ought to have those replacement brushes with you. We recommend having a spare freshwater pump, a raw water pump for your engine, obviously fuel and oil filters, filters for your water maker. You haven't thought about that, but you should have plenty of those. Obviously fuses for all of your electrical circuits, enough oil to do at least one oil change, and spare coolant. You should have some kind of emergency repair tape. The self-amalgamating type for hoses and pipes is suggested. Some Marine Techs for repairs, spare hose clamps, screws, a portable drill, and even a portable saw is suggested. I can't emphasize enough that you should have lots of Dyneema on board, because you can use that to make soft shackles if you know how, or you should learn, and if you don't, you should learn how. There's many different uses for Dyneema. Its strength is unmatched by any other line that you have on board. You also should have at least one replacement shackle for each type of shackle you have on board. This was a shackle where the pin kind of got loose and pretty bent. And I've got some other parts on board that have also experienced some major failures. It's nice to have spares, and if you don't have the spares for those, you can make them out of soft shackles and Dyneema. So that's kind of the backup. Also, make sure you've got zip ties, various lengths. The black is better than the white when it comes to UV resistance. A sail repair kit, palm and needles, and the appropriate threads. Now, it's highly recommended, and we have several webinars, and we will have one more probably coming up I know we will this fall. You should have your rig professionally inspected and tuned, but the inspection is really critical, because there are things that you're not going to see that a good rigger will notice, and the time to fix them is before you leave port. Also have your sails checked, and between your sail maker and your rigger, make sure that your reefing system does work. We had at least one boat probably in the last couple of rallies where particularly the in-mast reefing had issues. Usually, I think sometimes it's because of the age of the sail, sometimes it's some of the other parts, but really have that properly inspected and make sure it works. And make sure, I'll mention it later, but make sure everybody on the boat knows how to reef and to reef properly. Obviously have the sails checked. And when it comes to rigging and sail inspections, don't leave it for the last week. These tradespeople are really, and actually, when it comes to your engines, you're going to need inspections and service done. For all three of those things, you can't wait for the last minute. These folks are really busy. There aren't enough good ones out there. So a month or two before the rally, you should be, or your next offshore passage, you should be planning on getting this stuff done. Okay.
Alex,
Yeah.
Alex, I would suggest that it's never too early to start on any of this. My experience is that the sailing part of the trip, i.e. sails and provisioning and rigging inspections and all of that, of course, takes priority, but then you find yourself a week before departure and you haven't set up your communications. So it is never too early to start.
In fact, the reason we're doing this talk now, as opposed to maybe similar talk later, is because we know that the information we're passing on to you today is stuff that you need time to do this. It can't be all last minute. So as Tim said, start now. It's never too early. Having everything, it'll just be tremendous peace of mind to know that you've gotten it all done.
And I can assure you that my team and I will hunt you down if you haven't given us all the information that we need before you leave.
And they will. I can speak to that. Okay, there's some questions popping up, and we'll answer those when I get to the end of this section. Although the one about rig inspection, it should be done yearly. I can tell you, I had a rig inspection done 2 years ago. We replaced an upper shroud, and then we replaced the other side just to balance it. This past year, we did a rig inspection, and then we just did another one recently, and we found something that didn't show up in the previous inspection. So things, the particularly depending on where your wiring and your rigging was done, I've been told anecdotally that if you have a French boat, beware, because some of the metal that's being used is sourced in China, and as a result, it does tend to fail a little more or start to show signs of failure sooner than some of the American-made stainless. So it's something to watch out for, and that was one of our experiences this year. Didn't fail, but we caught it in time. By the way, so I also mentioned in terms of service, you should have your engine serviced. If you're capable of doing it yourself, great, but having it professionally serviced is a good idea. If you have a generator on board, have the generator serviced as well. Depending upon the age of your fuel tanks, you might want to consider having them professionally cleaned. The stuff that starts growing in them can become a real problem later in life. Your steering and your autopilot should be thoroughly checked and confirmed to be in good shape. Again, we've had boats on this year's rally who did have steering failures. They were able to manage getting their boats in on their own, but it took a lot of work, and I don't know that had they done the inspection and they could have found the problem in advance, but we highly recommend that you do have those systems checked. If you're a monohull with keel bolts, have that inspected and checked as well. Your anchor should be secured to the boat, not just by the chain, but in addition to the however you've attached it. Once you're offshore, you want to know that that's not going to come loose. And one thing we've suggested that you check with your engine manufacturer on what the minimum operating RPMs are, and how do you compensate for running the engine at low RPMs or kind of the minimum RPMs that you're making way but conserving fuel. Diesels supposedly don't like to run really slow, they like to work. So you need to know that you can do that. As I mentioned before, okay, I did mention before, learn how to make soft shackles. There's a lot of variants on how to do it, and there are a lot of good YouTube videos out there. If there's enough interest, we may actually do a webinar, because one of our Salty Dog members is really good at it. He taught me, and we would probably like to share that information. Last section that I want to talk about is crew preparation. At a minimum, you as the owner and your primary crew should have offshore passage experience of minimum of 3 nights or more. More is obviously better. We discuss in the handbook what those minimums are. You should, as was mentioned before, understand the medical requirements of your crew. One of the things that some of my crew have done, and I think going forward, we're going to require it everyone, is that they write on a piece of paper that gets put into an envelope that gets sealed, what their medical conditions are that perhaps are a little more personal, but in the event that they become incapacitated and need some kind of medical care, knowing everything about them or more than you might have wanted to know could be what'll save their lives. So having that information available is important. George mentioned the med kit. You should either have bought a packaged kit and then supplement it, or talk with your own physician about getting it. And then we've kind of mentioned the word practice, and you need to practice with all the equipment on board. Practice with the radar in daylight. Practice with your chart plotters, obviously. Know how to use your sat phone, make sure it actually does work. Suggestion is, depending upon how you access that sat phone, let's say it's via your smartphone, because I know on my Iridium, that's how we access it. But if your smartphone is locked because it only works with your thumbprint or whatever, your visual, whatever it is, make sure others on board have access to the code so they can open the phone. Or if you're using an iPad as a spare navigation device and it also locks, make sure they know the code to that. You can change it afterwards, but you've got to share all this so that if you're sick, if you're incapacitated, you've got a way out. I think somebody passed away on one of the Bermuda races, and because he fell overboard, by the way. And the crew on that boat was really limited for a while in terms of how they could communicate, because they didn't have all this information because it was with the owner, and the owner was the person that actually had passed.
Alex, on this line of thought, it's important for the skipper to make clear to the crew that if something happens to the skipper, who is the next person to take command? Who will be the next skipper? So that there has to be a chain of command. You can't have a free-for-all afterwards. So someone has to be designated the co-captain or whatever. I think to have a seamless decision-making structure.
Yep.
And I would add on the subject of medical situation, medical conditions, I really think the skipper should encourage the crew members to be honest about any condition they have. Not because they're necessarily going to disqualify that crew member because of it, but they might. And this goes to the subject of medication, and it goes, how much medication do you bring on the trip and the like.
Yeah, and by the way, with respect to medical services, we've done some webinars in the past on that, and we will go back and kind of refresh what's available. There are some services that you can get. I mean, not everybody's lucky enough to have a doctor on board. So, I mean, we've subscribed to a service where you can call them, you can email them, and if you need specific assistance, they will tell you what to do. They'll know what you've got on board. They should know about all your crew and what their conditions are. So there are a couple of options out there that you want to think about. And again, it's not something you want to do at the last minute, because it does take some time and preparation.
Absolutely.
Practice man overboard. Can't emphasize that enough. Practice using the emergency steering, and also that emergency tiller needs to be someplace that's accessible. Too often it ends up at the bottom of a locker. It really needs to be at the top. So, but that's again things you start to think about and take care of putting that in the right place. You should practice sailing your boat in somewhat heavy weather, practicing reefing. You want your crew to know how to do it. Can't emphasize that enough. And I'm going to go back and answer a couple of questions and then open the floor to any more. There's one or two that I won't be able to answer because I'm not sure the exact. Oh, so how important is a spare Alternator. Yeah, I guess it depends. If you only have one engine on your boat, if you're a catamaran, you've got two engines, you got two of everything. If you don't have a spare alternator, it means one engine may not be able to, fully properly charge, etc. But having that spare alternator and it's unique to your boat. If you're in the islands, you might be able to get a spare, you might be able to get somebody to rebuild it, but having that spare means that you're much more independent. Similar to what George said before, you can get yourself out of the problem that you've got on your own. So I would kind of vote for that. What gauge Dyneema should we have on board? I have to go check what sizes we've got. I've got some pretty thick stuff, and then we've got some pretty light Dyneema. We can get back to you on maybe what's recommended. And question about the repair tape. It's referred to as amalgamating. I think it kind of adheres to itself, and then I think if there's any heat coming from your pipes, it'll also help to make it stick better. Do you guys recall anything more about how to?
It's called self-amalgamating tape. If you go out on the web and just search rescue tape, there's any number of people selling it under that trade name.
Right.
West Marine has it. It's
right.
Pretty standard. You use it on lashing rigging and doing all kinds of things.
It comes in 1 inch, at least 1 inch and 2 inch kind of.
Right. But if you want it for your engine, you need to make sure that it has a heat variable so that it can take heat up to 180 degrees.
Okay. There was a question about rig inspections. Again, I highly recommend you do it every year. It's really a good insurance policy. Okay. And any other questions for me? All right. I would like to open the floor up to questions that anyone has on anything we haven't perhaps touched on. Let's see. I'm going to ask a question of Matt Carlson. Matt, when you only had one rudder on your cat, were you able to steer the boat? I guess you did. You can answer to me, and then I'll reply. It's another question just came up. Do we use Navionics in the Caribbean? Yes. The Navionics works really well.
Do you have to change chips on the way down?
Yes, you need to look at what chipset you've got, because I think there are several different Navionics chipsets depending upon what part of the world you're in. So sometimes I know on my chart plotter I've got two, and I switch between them. I've got one that's covering a certain area from basically the Chesapeake down to I think the Keys, and then I switch to a different chart. Then I switch to a Navionics chipset for further south, and then when I go further north, I have to switch another one. So,
whose electronics do you have on your boat, Alex?
We've got B&G.
B&G, okay. Yeah, it depends on the electronics manufacturer and the size of the cartography on the card that you buy.
Yeah,
we had Ray Marine, and we had to change 3 times, like Alex.
Right. I see one question that says, any thoughts on Starlink? At this point, we are conditionally approving Starlink as a communications device offshore. We certainly recommend you've got to do the mobile maritime plan. You have to opt into mobile maritime, or you're not going to have coverage. You will drop off when you get too far from the shore. If you want to use your Starlink as a tracking device, then you need to have a PredictWind data hub which hooks into the Starlink, and it sends all of your data to predict wind, your instrument data as well as your position data back to predict when it shows up on our tracking map.
Is that a subscription to predict wind, Tim?
No, the data hub is not a subscription. It's a little device that hooks into the Ethernet connection.
Oh,
And then for our members, all you need is a free Predict Wind account to show up on the tracking map. If you want to continue to use it after the rally, then you'll need to have a paid subscription.
And by the way, two things. One with respect to that, I highly recommend you consider a paid. I'm not trying to sell Predict Wind, but having full access to their models is really, really useful. You may be asking for help from Chris Parker as well, but you can learn over time how to use those tools on your own, and it'll give you a lot of peace of mind and clarity as to what's going on. One thing I don't think we mentioned anywhere is you should have a bosun's chair that you know how to use, because you will probably have more than one need. There'll be more than one time that you need to go up the mast, and you want to know that you can go up safely and get back down. So add that to your kit.
Yeah, as well as somebody who's willing to go up the mast.
Right.
somebody under 40.
I went up for my 70th birthday.
My son went up for his 7th birthday.
Well, the little ones love it, but they usually don't know what to do once they get to the top.
Right.
So, there was one other thing I was just going to mention.
I didn't talk about ditch kits. I was going along, and I just would like to mention that if you're heading offshore, you have a life raft, of course, but you need to have a ditch kit that is going to keep you alive. The stuff inside your life raft will keep you alive for 24 hours. There's enough water for 24 hours and not much else. There's maybe a signaling device, but basically you need to have a ditch kit that you keep in a cockpit locker that's right handy. So if you deploy the life raft and you are getting ready to step up into the life raft from your sinking vessel, you have in the life raft the stuff that will keep you going for 10 days or so. Even though in the age of EPIRB, the average rescue time for people at sea is under 36 hours, you still need to figure that you're going to have to look after yourself for a while. So you need to have water, you need to have energy bars, you need to have space blankets, little ones. You need to have some a fishing kit, and you need to have communications, which is a VHF radio, a sat phone, which normally you would, if the boat's sinking, you'd grab the sat phone and throw it into the ditch kit, but you need to have some way of communicating, and even an old-fashioned signaling mirror and flares need to be part of that package. So just think about it, and when you're in your planning, in your preparations phase for going offshore, a ditch kit should be well thought out.
Yeah, absolutely. And as your flares, preferably SOLAS flares, go out of date, put the most recently out of date ones into your ditch kit, so you already have the flares there, just in case you can't grab your flare kit. And if you want to read a great story about going into the raft without your ditch kit, read Adrift by Steve Callahan. The book was released in 1981. I don't know if you can get it on Kindle. He spent 76 days in his raft. His boat sank out from underneath him in the Med in 45 seconds. And he spent 76 days in the raft.
Yeah, well, I'd also remind folks, another reason why you want that life raft is, as George mentioned it, there are things you're going to hit. I mean, there was a boat that many of us know about that hit a whale someplace in the Pacific. They went down in 15 minutes. They did have the time to launch their raft. I think they also launched their dinghy. They were picked up, I think, within 24 hours, less than 24 hours.
Yeah, they were in 24 hours, I think, yeah.
But they, that's that's why you want that life raft. Stuff happens.
Yeah.
So, all right, we got one or two other reminders here. That you need a charger. You should have a charger for your Iridium in your phone that you particularly that can go into that ditch kit in case you're going to need it. And there was also a note, although I've never tried it. There's ATN does sell a self-climbing rig. So if you need to go up the rig, there's a way of doing it if you're on your own. Bill
Yeah,
Burnham,
I've tried it and you have to be reasonably athletic
okay.
to do it.
I know my rigger used to use it all the time, but it's not something that's not, I think it's good to know that it's out there and available. All right. So if there are no other questions, I just, again, reminder in the chat, I put the links. You should take a look at those documents and reconsider a lot of the things we've talked about. Start working on it now. It's never too soon. By the way, Matt Carlson got back to me and did mention that it's much nicer to be able to have two rudders than one. I mean, he was able to manage the boat when he only had one, but two is better. So,
And I will add any questions on electronics or communications or safety gear, Tim at saltydogsailing.org.
yep. All right. So with that, I'm going to end the recording and say thanks to George, thanks to Tim. Thank you, all of you, for participating today. And remember, we've got another one coming up on the 31st, and we'll talk about all the other cool things that you really should think about having. All right. Thanks again.
Thanks, guys, for showing up.